Now let's look at the main problem, which is the U.S. unfunded liabilities. You know, all of these government programs are great. They all help a lot of people, and we should have them. The question that I've always asked, who's going to pay for these things? How are we going to pay for all the things that the government wants to do for us? And I'm all for them. I'm not against them. I know that Social Security's helped a lot of people, Medicaid, Medicare, all of them, Obamacare. But the question is, how do we pay for it? There's no argument about the fact that we should have them. The question is, how do we pay for it? Now, take a look at this. Sometimes the best intentions produce the worst results. And there's nothing that will show that better than these statistics. These are all good intentions. Look at the results. In 2003, our unfunded liabilities, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the government programs, had a $39 trillion unfunded liability. That means we're going to have to come up with $39 trillion. I was so concerned about that in 2004 that I wrote an 88-page newsletter. 88 pages telling you about all these things, and I thought, it just can't go on anymore. How can we fund $39 trillion of unfunded liabilities? Well, in 2008, it went up to 65, and today it's 2013, it's 84 trillion, and I'm still scratching my head saying, I can't believe that we run up this kind of debt and we're still going. But somewhere along the line, something has to be done. Now, a lot of people feel that the way to solve this problem is to raise taxes, and especially on the wealthy. Why shouldn't the wealthy pay more? They're living so well, they've got all this money, and all these people are struggling with their medical insurance and so forth. Well, let's take a look at this and see if that's really realistic. Take a look at the 2000 tax returns. This is the top 1%, 5, 10, and 25%. Now, if you look at the top 1%, they make $1.5 trillion. They pay $354 billion in taxes, which is 37% of the taxes. So the top 1% pays 37% of all the taxes. Now, let's just, for sake of imagination, because you could never get away with it, you can raise them a little bit, but you're not going to raise them double. Let's just double their taxes. Let's just say, by golly, it's time to get our debts down to pay all these wonderful programs. Let's raise them $354 billion. If you took the top 1% and you doubled their taxes, and you took that $354 billion and paid it to the unfunded liabilities, it'd take you 200 years to pay it off. So obviously, that's going to not solve the problem because you probably can't even double their taxes. But if you could, it still would take 200 years. So on the right-hand column, I said, well, let's look at the corporations. They're so wealthy, they've got so much cash, they're making so much money. They're making $2 trillion and they're paying $418 billion in taxes. Let's just double the taxes on the corporation. So you double the tax on the corporation, you got $418 billion. It takes you 237 years to pay it off. So obviously, raising taxes is not going to solve the problem. It's a Band-Aid. It doesn't do anything. But here's the worst thing about raising taxes, and nobody talks about that. And this is what we call Hauser's Law. There was a very good economist, money manager, who kind of put this idea all together. And it goes to show you what happens if you raise taxes. Now, believe it or not, after the war, the top marginal tax rate, that's the top rate that you pay on the top money you make, was almost 84 to 85%. It almost got as high as 90 at one time. And look at the federal government on the bottom. That's their revenue. You notice when the taxes were into 90%, they didn't make any more money on the revenue they had. They made 20%. As the taxes has gone down, they're still only making 19%. So whether you raise the taxes to 90% at the top bracket or leave it where they are, the government is not going to make more than 19 to 20%. What is the reason for that? How could they not make more money if they're getting more in taxes? The reason is all this ingenuity, all of this brain power that creates the Apple and the Microsoft and the Nikes and all these Amazons, all these great companies, that kind of energy goes into saving money on taxes. So instead of building companies, they build tax shelters. They devise companies that lose money so they get tax breaks. They take this creativity and they bring it overseas and they invest overseas. They put it in tax shelters and foreign banks. They rush all over the world to try to cut their tax bracket down so they don't have to pay that much in taxes. And in so doing it, the productivity of this country goes down, we produce less goods, and even though the government gets a higher share of the profits, they make less money because their revenue goes down. So raising taxes, as you can see, even if you took the top 5%, is not going to solve the problem. Well, if that's the situation, what could solve the problem? What do we do? What is the best policy for this government to do? Well, let's take a look at Social Security. If you look at Social Security, it is based on the fact that the government runs out the statistics for 75 years, and then they present value it back, and so they say over the next 75 years we're going to collect this much, the economy is going to grow this much, we're going to collect, and we have this much in liability. And it's based on 2.2% growth in the economy. That is the good news. That at least one thing that the actuaries did is they used a very conservative growth rate. So if we grow faster than that, we can do a lot better. But let me give you just one caveat about economic projections. And I learned this from President Nixon. He wasn't the most admired president I had, but he had a couple of great insights, and this was one of them. I have found that my economic advisors are not always right, but they are always sure. So the point is that when you look at economic projections by the government, you can almost count on the fact that they're not going to come in, and they're always going to be more rather than less. Let me give you an example. In 1963, they started off Medicare, and they projected that by 1990, the Medicare cost would be $9 billion. So in 1963, 30 years ahead, they said it'd be about $9 billion. The actual cost at that time was $67 billion. So it went from $9 billion to $67 billion. And this has been true of all of these different programs. But let me give you one thing that is a little bit encouraging. In 2003, there was a report out that said that Social Security projections that they would be out of money by 2037. So that was the projection in 2003. 5 years later, the projection showed that it was 10 years longer. So, while it may not be the final solution, the real answer to this problem in Social Security, Medicare, and all of these government programs is that if you want to continue with these programs, you have to cut the costs now in the programs, and then you have to grow the economy. And the way you grow the economy is by giving entrepreneurs incentive to build businesses, to create products, and to create jobs. And that pushes everything forward. And if we were to do that, we would definitely have a chance of working our way out. And it's really our only hope.